So my presentation is on the Russian-Ukrainian war and how it has impacted the food energy scarcity within underdeveloped nations. My research question being, how has the Russian-Ukrainian war impacted food energy scarcity among underdeveloped nations? First, we're going to walk through the introduction to the war, what happened, and how it has been occurring since then. Second, I'll go over my method for performing my research. Next, my data analysis. Fourth, my limitations, implications, and lastly, my conclusion. So the introduction to the war started in 2022, February 23rd. This war has been building for quite some time, with the annexation of Crimea occurring in 2014 and showing some implications that the war may be about to occur. So in 2021, they totaled the 27.4 billion. So 40% of the GDP that Ukraine was exporting was all agricultural related, and this led me to my research question of how food has been impacted across underdeveloped nations, considering underdeveloped nations are quite unsustainable in terms of food and agriculture. So next, what I hypothesized was that the food and the fuel will be very much interconnected. With this hypothesis, I needed to look at both how fuel has impacted underdeveloped nations and lack of fuel, and how food has also impacted the GDP of these nations. So next, we're going to look at the annexation of Crimea in 2014. So what this is in 2014, Crimea was annexed by Russian Federation, and many Crimean citizens lost their citizenship and their right to employment without making themselves a Russian citizen. What this has to do with the food energy scarcity is that this severely limited how agriculture sectors ran and the productivity within Crimea. So leading up to out of this, the Alliance in Humanitarian Aid has been severely impacted from the Russian-Ukrainian war. Primarily, I needed to look at the start of the war, the early days of 2022, whenever the Black Sea blockade first came into view, and then I needed to look at upcoming days and how this has impacted from the war. But to do that, I need to look at how 2018, specifically 2018, because COVID-19 happened in 2020. Because of this, I needed to look at a date that was prior to the pandemic in order to get a grasp of how global GDP has actually been impacted. Based on this, I needed to look at different countries and where the food exports and fuel exports have been implemented into. So the initial impact of this war, from my literature review, I discovered was most severely impacting the sub-Saharan desert. Countries within this region were most severely impacted because most of their food products come from Ukraine and Russia, most specifically Russia. And then as I looked through this, the data that I later will talk about, I actually discovered that fuel was not severely impacted because most of these sub-Saharan African countries were actually getting their fuel from the Middle East rather than from Ukraine or Russia. So next I'm going to be talking about my method. And the source that I derived this method from was entitled Countries' Vulnerability to Food Supply Disruptions Caused by the Russian-Ukraine War from a Trade Dependency Perspective. So this source was incredibly useful in terms of gathering my quantitative data. So this source first led me to discovering what aspects I needed to look at. And what I discovered from this was I needed to look at export quantities from Russia and Ukraine, and then I needed to look at these countries that were most significantly impacted, and I needed to assess their vulnerability. Assessing their vulnerability includes one of two things. It includes looking at the imports they gathered from Russia and Ukraine, and it also includes looking at the sum of all of the sum of how they have been impacted by other countries. As you can see with the second formula here, this is looking at how Ukraine has changed in imports. If you look at the sum right there, you can see that it is looking at time as well. So what I needed to do was I needed to measure import quantities from 2018 and from 2022 and discovered how that has changed. That was the first step of my research after the initial literature review. Secondly, I needed to look at the qualitative analysis, and this included looking at multiple annotated sources because these sources needed to decipher the data that I found. The primary data point that I needed to look into was Egypt and how it had been impacted. The reason I needed to look at Egypt is because it did not severely say how they have changed. Egypt changed their domestic fuel production and their domestic agricultural production through their government in order to try to offset the impact of the war, and I will later tell you why. So there has been an addition of 307 deaths per million, and because of that, it is important to note that this war has impacted several. So next we're going to be looking at my data. First we'll be looking at the quantitative data, next the qualitative data I found. So this is specifically looking at the real GDP loss from Ukraine and Russia because I needed to look at the GDP and how it has been lost. I needed to look at which specific countries were impacted from this loss in GDP. While this may seem not a lot initially, you can tell that it actually significantly was a lot because it was approximately a loss of 50% of their GDP for Ukraine and approximately more than 20% for Russia. So looking back at this graph, we can tell that multiple countries have significantly been impacted. But as I will talk about next, we needed to look at how grain and fuel has been impacted. From my research, I derived that fuel actually did not significantly impact any countries, rather, except for Egypt. What I discovered from this qualitative analysis was that Egypt was most significantly impacted because it did have a lot of fuel commodities coming from Russia compared to other sub-Saharan African countries which gathered fuel commodities from the Middle East. However, Egypt was also significantly impacted by grain commodities, making it the most significantly impacted underdeveloped country from the Russian-Ukraine war. Alongside Egypt, there was also Kenya and Libya who were most significantly impacted within this region, and one could argue most significantly impacted overall aside from Ukraine and aside from Russia. So these three countries were most significantly impacted because of their initial reliance. But what I would like to talk about now is how Egypt has tried to solve this. Egypt tried to solve this through an increase in domestic agricultural production, but this isn't a solution for all. Egypt is in the sub-Saharan African region, and because of this, suddenly changing the crop cycles would be not as productive. So my initial hypothesis that the fuel and food commodities would be equivalently impacted in sub-Saharan countries were rejected because the fuel trade was not as significantly impacted. And next we'll be going over the limitations of the study and what can be done. So one main limitation was that it does not count for COVID-19. While I did try to minimize the impact by setting the data year to 2018 through 2023, I was not able to significantly go back further without possibly having the annexation of Crimea impact the results. So with that knowledge, I also did not account for any changes in climate change, because climate change has significantly impacted crop cycles and growing seasons. It does not account for how that has impacted the agricultural industry. Next, due to the recency of the United States tariffs, it is likely that this supply of food will significantly be more impacted within the next few months or years. Next, we'll be going on the implications and what the static could mean for the global economy. So, malnutrition has evidently increased. As spoken earlier, there's additional 307 deaths estimated per 1 million persons. Because of this has significantly had an impact on the world and it needs to be aided. Next, I'm going to talk about humanitarian aid. It has not properly been applied. While it has been applied to Ukraine, of course, it has not significantly been aiding in malnutrition among countries such as Egypt, Kenya, and Libya. Lastly, a reduction of tariffs is a possible solution. This did occur within the first initial year of the war. There was the Black Sea blockade, and a combat of this was reducing tariffs, although they have been increased lately by those countries after the initial impact of the Black Sea blockade was over. So, an increase in reduction of tariffs could actually help this. Lastly, we're going to go over conclusions and my final points of review. So, what I conclude from this presentation is that the sub-Saharan African region of Africa has most significantly been impacted. Secondly, these changes in fuel and food trade are not sustainable in the long run, and humanitarian aid is not sustainable in the long run, and a solution needs to be made from this. And lastly, the hypothesis from food and fuel commodities being equivalent is rejected. And I'd like to thank Mr. Horn and Mr. Gibson for helping me in my research. And here's my resources. And now we will move on to oral defense.
All right, Mr. Gibson.
Sure. Glad to be able to see it as a presentation more than just reading it. So I appreciate that today. The first thing that I'd like to talk to you about is really your hypothesis. Through your system here, you have rejected your original hypothesis. And as any time we were doing research like this, how are you reframing it for future research? What questions have this research opened up for you that would lead to a reframing of your hypothesis in a new direction?
So if I were to move this hypothesis in a new direction, knowing what I did now, I would actually change my hypothesis to look more into how these exports have impacted the lives of people, and I would say that I would definitely say that it's going to significantly impact the lives, of course. But if I were to ask this question again, I would reframe it to seeing what could be done rather than what is currently being done.
Okay. Great. I'd like to ask a little bit about a specific piece of research that you did for the negotiations and the reopening of the Black Sea between Ukraine and Russia. You do mention that there was that full year, the first year of the conflict, where the Black Sea was effectively locked down by the Russian Black Sea fleet. How has the situation with the division of the Black Sea between Ukrainian and Russian waters continued since those negotiations? Are we still seeing that negotiations are holding as we look at the war today?
Okay, I'm glad you asked about that because I didn't really talk about that much in my presentation. The initial UN response from that was lowering tariffs, and what they ended up doing was they had this kind of negotiation between countries where they reduced tariffs and they had this train system where agricultural products would still get shipped to Africa, but it would be at a significant cost, to be honest. So that's what went on initially, but currently I do believe that while this blockade is no longer in place, I do believe that there is still tariffs that are occurring.
Right. Excellent. I would also curious is you do talk about the limitations of methodology, which I think is a vital aspect in understanding how your research is being applied to your question. But did you run into any limitations on the research itself during that phase of your project?
Limitations of, yeah, I actually did. So the biggest limitation was certain websites like the World Trade Organization. That was a big website that I used in my initial data collection, although I did end up moving to other resources because I was solely reliant on that in the initial part before I realized that resource wasn't entirely reliable for the sources I was going for. The reason that I say that it is unreliable was simply because it did not have any data further than 2023 because the fiscal year for collecting that data is a year and it is collected in April. So sometime this month actually there will be data, but it won't. I already completed the research that I had, so that is the main reason I could not effectively gather research until later into my research process.
Okay. I think that's it for me.
Okay, I'd like you to go back to the equations you brought up. I want to talk a little about those. Okay, so I want just to kind of walk me through and explain those equations, particularly obviously the Ukraine change in exports. I just want to make sure
Yeah.
I understand.
So the Russian-Ukraine change in exports, that's actually going to be looking at, I worded that wrong on the slide. This is looking at Russia, is looking at the time frame, and then that's the sum of the commodity that I'm looking at. So I looked at 9 different commodities for the food aspect, and then I just looked at fuel and petroleum products for the fuel aspect in my research. But looking at those first 2 equations, they kind of go together because those 2 equations are looking at Russia and then one's looking at Ukraine, but it is from the perspective of each individual country. So that would be the equivalent of seeing like how the quantity of how Egypt has the value of its trade dependency. So it's looking at the time frame, so it's looking at 2018 through 2023, and then it's looking at the quantity of that and how significant its reliance is on Ukraine or Russia. And then the last equation is the Hirschman Herbal Index. That is just a sum of all. That's supposed to say n equals I, but it's very difficult to format in Google Slides. But it's basically just the sum of all commodities in order to like grasp the full value of that. So we'll use those 2 equations in the last equation.
Okay, so let's go back to August. You're contemplating a topic you are going to ultimately cover. What other area of research or question did you consider in your research process and ultimately discarded and why?
Oh, so initially I actually wanted to look at how refugees have been impacted on the Russian-Ukraine war. I actually wanted to kind of do an interview before I realized that was not at all, I was not capable of doing that. And I also realized that measuring how refugees have fled Ukraine and have fled Russia, I realized that that wasn't really something I was capable of looking at because there just isn't data on that.
Okay. So you've got your research for now in April. What's the next step? You've got some data, obviously. You talked a little bit about implications, but what's the next step? Where is the next phase of the research go? If someone were to take this and go in a direction, where would that direction be?
So if someone were to take my research, I would honestly hope that they would be taking my research using the data I found and using it to look at solutions for this issue. I would hope that they would be looking into like how countries can implement better domestic production. Obviously Egypt is a good example of that, but then countries like Kenya and Libya have not significantly impacted changed domestic productions.
And just because your mentor is here, explain to us what role your mentor played in the research process and what did you gain from that?
Right, he really played a big role in the beginning aspect of my research where I had absolutely no clue what to do. I actually wasn't even aware that the Black Sea blockade existed until he told me in about October. So he really helped that initial aspect of the research, and it led me to realize which countries were more significantly impacted. He kind of led me to the sub-Saharan African region, and he really narrowed down my focus of research through that.
All right, congratulations, you're finished.